started. We're going to go till about 10:15 or 10:20 if we have enough animating us between now and then. For those of you who don't know our panelists, on my far right, your far left, Michael Cohen is co-director of the Privatization of Foreign Policy Initiative here at the New America Foundation. By the way, I'm Steve Call. I'm the president of the New America Foundation. Michael worked at the State Department and is a speechwriter for Bill Richardson and Stuart Eisenstadt during his time in government. Next to him, coming toward me, is Jim Pinkerton, who worked in the White House under Presidents Reagan and George H.W. Bush. He's been a columnist and a writer and a commentator since then, and he is the author of What Comes Next, The End of Big Government and the New Paradigm Ahead. And he worked as an informal advisor to the Huckabee campaign, I think, during the primary season. Chris Hayes is a Bernard Schwartz Fellow at the New America Foundation. He's the Washington editor of The Nation. If you read The Nation, American Prospect, New Republic, Washington Monthly, other fine publications, you read his stuff regularly. He's on TV a lot these days, too. And next to him is another Bernard Schwartz Fellow at New America, Rehan Salam, who's an associate editor at The Atlantic. He's worked for NBC and the New York Times and the New Republic, and he's the co-author of a much remarked upon and admired book this year called Grand New Party, How Conservatives Can Win the Working Class and Save the American Dream. So we're not going to insist that the two notional Democratic commentators stay within their lanes, nor that Jim and Rehan do the same, but we'll probably start there. So why don't we have done no preparation or rehearsal of this panel. that is a New America tradition that you should value because free thinking, intellectual independence, and spontaneity are some of our core values, yes. But what I thought I would ask each of you to do within your lanes to start is to talk briefly about one aspect of the campaign or the result that you think is truly distinctive or durable and that is not already oversaturated with commentary. So yeah. So I mean, you start with the idea that this election looked structurally forecastable, especially after mid-September. And so we spent a lot of time, because our media economy insists upon it, commenting on the surface narrative, but there was an obvious, deep underlying structure that informed the result. And yet, within the patterns of the narrative and the personalities in the coalitions, presumably there are sources of distinction or surprise or possibly, durable politics that people are not focused on. So if you can identify something like that. Michael, you look like you're thinking. If you want to wait, I can ask someone else.
I'm good. I'm good. All right. Well, thanks, Steve. I appreciate the introduction. I'm thinking about this before. I think there's sort of two ways to look at the election. There's sort of the uncomplicated reasons why Obama won, and the more complicated reasons. And the obvious uncomplicated one, I mean, he was the change candidate in a year that was a change election. And I think to me, this is a pretty standard sort of way that we see what happens in American politics. It was sort of the case with Reagan in 80, with Clinton in 92. You can go back to FDR in 32. Change candidates generally win in change elections. And of course, Obama's message all about change, and on a personal level, I mean, his image, he simply embodied change as the first African American candidate for president. I think in that sense he was also very lucky about the opponents that he faced. That's always an important part of politics we forget about, which is luck. First of all, on the surface, facing Hillary Clinton is obviously a great challenge, but it allowed him to create a real contrast between his message of change and her message that was more status quo oriented. And certainly in the general, I mean, I've said this to many people months ago, that he couldn't have asked for a better opponent than John McCain, in the sense that it allowed him to run on a change message more effectively. I'm convinced that if he had faced off against a Mitt Romney or Mike Huckabee, it would have actually been, he probably still would have won, but it would have been a more difficult race, because it would have been harder to make the stark contrast between change versus more of the same. And also, I mean, obviously, from the perspective of a candidate, he had more money than his opponent. He had a better ground game. Both of those certainly helped. But I think the flip side is what was unusual about Obama. And I think there's two things. I mean, first, everyone comments on him being obviously the first African American president. But to me, what's so crazy about this is that he actually used race to his advantage in a way that I think he neutralized it or may have actually helped him. if you look at his numbers among, obviously among African American voters, but among Hispanic voters, among young voters, he did far better than John Kerry did, and far better than any Democrats done in a while. And I think that actually, in some ways, may have balanced out any loss he might have had among white voters. And it does seem as though his greatest loss among white voters was probably in the South. In fact, he got the highest percentage of white votes since 1976 in Jimmy Carter, which is pretty amazing. I think the thing that I find most striking about this is that Barack Obama ran for president, been 2 years in the campaign trail. He's now president-elect, and he pretty much didn't piss anybody off. I mean, he pretty much ran a campaign that was sort of populist, but not divisively populist. And in a sense that you look at his approval now, it's about 70%. And I can't think of any candidate who's ever done this before, who's ever run and really not create a sort of whole segment of the population that can't stand him. Sure, there are sort of unreconstructed, I guess, conservatives who continue who don't trust him or don't think he's going to be a good president. But you don't get the sense of partisanship from, say, Bill Clinton in '92 or George Bush in 2000. And it gives him, I think, a pretty extraordinary mandate to govern, actually, in some respect, because he really is in almost uncharted territory of being a universally sort of, or generally, light candidate on a personal level. And I saw today he had 25 million people watched his 60 Minutes interview on Sunday. And I don't think those are all Democrats watching. I think there's a lot of enthusiasm around his candidacy. It's a tribute to the kind of campaign he ran, but I think it's also suggests that he has a lot of leeway when he gets into office in January. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jim to tell me all the reasons why I'm wrong.
Actually, I think, Michael, if your mission was to say why the Democrats succeeded, I guess it falls to me to say why the Republicans failed. So I think you'll probably find some agreement here. I just came back from the Republican Governors Association meeting in Miami, and Haley Barbour, the governor of Mississippi, who's former Republican National Committee chairman, probably the most respected Republican political head in America, said to the multitudes, "Look, folks, you can't let your wars go on too long." He quoted George C. Marshall writing to General Patton or something like 1943, from some book he'd been reading, and I thought that was and then a bunch of people, including Bill Bennett and somebody from National Review, came out afterwards, and nobody said, "Oh, no, the war was great. The war was a wonderful idea." There's a settled consensus now in the post-Bush, post-McCain Republican Party about the war. I think is going to be a valuable hinge in Republican politics. Obviously, that didn't do McCain any good to have that as consensus reached afterwards. But I do think that we have seen the end of what Mike Gerson called heroic conservatism, which was never really a conservative idea. And I think the Republican Party will resume a kind of a normalcy, which, again, the bubbles burst in lots of different ways. Looking ahead, I think there are other issues concerning this. What Republicans can take away from 2008 is that right now there are two Wall Street parties. At a time when Wall Street is remarkably unpopular, there are the Republicans who get the blame for Wall Street and everything that went wrong and the bailout, and there are the Democrats who don't get the blame but do get the money. And I think that this is something Republicans are going to have to come to grips with. Rayhan will have more to say about this, I'm sure. But this notion of the Republican Party as the party that's bailing out Wall Street, which is true. There's no denying that Bush and Paulson and McCain all supported the bailout strongly. Obviously, the Republican base hated it, and I think that will be a major hinge in future Republican politics as to who supported the bailout and who didn't. I think the Republicans are going to have to come to grips with the election results, which showed, for example, that not only did the Democrats win huge in Manhattan and San Francisco and Santa Clara County, which is Silicon Valley, but in fact, the Democrats won 11 of the 12 states with the highest per capita income. And the Republicans won 11 of the 12 states with the lowest per capita income. So it's a new world, and where there's the economic royalists, if you will, are in the other party, and Republicans haven't quite figured that out. But something tells me, as they say about pragmatics in desperation, you start to realize things you hadn't thought about before.
Let's see, how's that work? So I think that, well, the first thing, just quickly to respond to Jim, Andrew Gellman has this wonderful book called Rich State, Poor State, Red State, Blue State, in which he talks about exactly these kind of class dynamic distinctions within the two parties. And it's a little misleading, I think, to talk about it at the state level, because actually when you break down within states, first of all, if you break down the electorate by income quintiles, you still have a fairly robust result, which has remained constant, in which the bottom two vote for Democrats, the top two vote for Republicans, and the middle two or the middle one is up for grabs.
Obama carried over
200,000.
200,000.
Right. So
He carried Greenwich
And
Connecticut.
also
Right.
10 million plus.
Right. So we've seen that change quite definitively in this election, but the change in the income bracket there was not outperformed the general change of the electorate by not a huge amount. So there's this sort of marginal change. I think that in terms of the funding base of the Democratic Party, it's a legitimate point. I think the thing to me that was most lasting, I think there's these broader demographic trends. Obama, as has been remarked upon a lot, he actually won white voters by a smidge more than John Kerry, but he got the rest of his margin from two factors. One, the fact the electorate became less white, and two, his margins among non-white Americans were much, much, much higher. The New York Times had this great map you could play around with, and you could look at the counties that compared the results of 2004, 2008, and the county that Barack Obama outperformed John Kerry by the most was Honolulu, which kind of makes sense. He's a native son, and John Kerry notoriously unpopular in Honolulu. But the second county was in the Rio Grande Valley, and it was around McCarran, Texas, and it was a county that's about 80% Latino. So that was the number 2 county in which Obama outperformed John Kerry, and the margin swing among Latinos was remarkable, particularly given all the talk that was happening in the primaries in the contest between Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama about this kind of black-brown divide and whether he could win Latinos, et cetera. So that demographic trend. And then the last thing I'll say is that, it's easy. I think we should all resist. We all kind of play this game, particularly in the opinion media where I come from, in which, we all sort of go through something of a kabuki dance after an election like this, in which we, the left says this was a mandate for socialism and redistribution, which I actually kind of believe. And then the right says, well, I saw Karl Rove in New York Times Magazine saying, well, he only got 1.3% more of the higher vote total than George Bush. And the fact of the matter is, Tom Scheller, who's sitting there right now, turned to me when we were at an event in Manassas, which was Barack Obama's last event. He said, look, if you ran for president, on the Democratic Party, you'd probably get around 42, 43, 44%. We're dealing with the nature of the two-party coalitions are such that there's a kind of structural floor for both parties, and so it's easy to kind of overinterpret elections. That said, I do think that we really did see kind of the death of Reaganism in this election. And I think it's really useful, and I was just in Switzerland for a week, and I spent a lot of time with 3 young Republican Party state representatives talking about the election. And one of the things that I kept coming back to them was that the catechism, the kind of Reaganite catechism developed in 1980, was developed under just objectively very different circumstances in the world. This is something that Ross and Reihan talk a lot about in their book, but there was tax bracket creep. There was much higher levels of taxation. There was unemployment at 8% and inflation around 9%. There was interest rates of 18%, which created all sorts of crazy economic distortions. The nature of the sort of institutional structures of American governance in the sort of crucible in which Reaganism was formed are very, very different than the conditions of American political economy today. And I think that we saw that going back to this kind of old-time religion about redistribution and tax cuts, which has been so effective for 28 years, did not sort of pay off in this election. I think that's a big takeaway.
With regard to the transition that Chris is alluding to, I think that it's interesting. There's a wonderful cover story in the latest issue of Forbes, which is not a magazine I normally read, but perhaps I ought to, by a woman named Janet Nowak. And it was about how you're going to see a structural ratchet upwards in the tax take of GDP, pretty much, regardless of circumstance, regardless of who is in power, because you just have a lot of structural spending baked in the cake, and chances are what you're most likely to see, I don't want to frighten any of you, but is a VAT, and a VAT is something that I've kind of always been fairly sympathetic to, but it's very interesting because when Chris is talking about the kind of political economy of the late 1970s, it's actually very interesting because you saw the situation where you had successful quote unquote neoliberal revolutions in Britain and in the United States. You didn't see them happen in countries where you had a VAT. You didn't see them in countries where actually the right and the left saw themselves as sharing in a kind of modernizing project. But you did see them in countries that actually were structurally designed almost for as being more favorable to the left in theory. In Britain and the US, the tax code was actually much more progressive at that point in time, and actually union density was much higher in the United States than it was in France, in the private sector. So it's actually very interesting because when you think of where that backlash came from, you could say that it came from some structural right-wingery in the American soul or something like that, or you could say that Ted Kennedy could have won in 1980 in a slightly different world, and Ronald Reagan happened to win because he represented change. So similarly, as to the debate of kind of whether or not a lot of kind of conservatives have been talking about how this election somehow ratifies that America is a center-right country. It's interesting, and it's certainly true that actually, our friend Mark Schmidt is in the audience today, and he made a very kind of astute argument concerning taxes and how the rhetoric of taxes has changed in sort of the broader political environment. Are we living in the end of the kind of Grover Norquist kind of reflexive anti-tax era? And while actually I'm sympathetic to Mark's interpretation, it's not obvious necessarily from the way the campaign worked. In that Barack Obama did emphasize that sort of 95% of the population is going to get a tax cut. And another thing that's striking is that if you look at those 200,000 plus voters, who went just slightly for Obama over McCain, this is a group that is presumably going to be very well aware of the fact that they were kind of explicitly called out and sort of that they're likely to see somewhat higher taxes. But it's also interesting when you kind of decompose that group in terms of their narrative experience. The ones who are kind of exurban voters versus those who are voters from the biggest metropolitan areas. And those who are from the biggest metropolitan areas, they also have the benefit of a state and local tax exemption, deduction rather. They are also people who are more worried about their health insurance premiums, traffic congestion, and a whole series of other issues where they believe that the Democratic Party is going to be their ally. So to the point that Jim raised earlier on, I mean, I think that, and with regard to the kind of Gelman sort of data, it's certainly true that the Democratic Party looks a little bit more high-tone than it did before. And while the Republican Party certainly does represent a lot of rich people, you're seeing this change in the composition of both coalitions. And that is going to imply some degree of policy tension and policy change on both sides. I think with the Republican side, it's more obvious, it's sharper, because if you look at sort of the kind of ideological pieces of kind of Reaganism, they really don't make as much sense. I think that sort of, kind of the heart of the ideas do, and I'll get to that in a sec. But then when you're looking at the Democratic side of it, I mean, you have a lot of Democrats who are deeply concerned about the AMT. They're deeply concerned about getting hit by the AMT, and they are going to want to have their interests protected. And someone like a Chuck Schumer, there are a lot of people who represent these kind of high tax, kind of alternative minimum tax. I'm sure that a lot of you are kind of worried about the alternative minimum tax yourself. And so, I mean, I think that, that's going to be interesting to see how that circle is squared. And I think that when you're looking at, for example, Obama's real caution and his real strategic shrewdness with regard to healthcare, I think you're seeing a situation where they want to be a kind of broadly pro-business party. They want to build a kind of coalition of corporate interests as well as kind of, working and middle-class voters that's going to build them a durable progressive majority, which is why, I think the healthcare plan as designed was so shrewd. So to me, a crucial question over the next few months will be the health insurance exchange. Is there going to be a big public option? If there is a big public option, then I think you're looking at a situation where actually the politics of this country might be permanently changed.
Go ahead, sorry.
Oh, no, please.
I was just going to say, can I make one point on the,
Sure,
on the rich people distinction? I think that the distinction, and it explains some of the data going back and forth, is between finance and manufacturing. The coast and Hollywood. Finance and Hollywood are solidly Democratic and have been the big winners. Manufacturing has been the big loser. And so you can still be rich. You can still be a rich Republican manufacturer, but find yourself outbid by the other coalition. The most striking example was the struggle over whether oil speculation involved in the run-up on oil prices. And there was a coalition created, this was in the Politico a few months ago, created by, I think, the airlines, the timber industry, the trucking industry, and some other old line, low prestige industry, saying we don't think there should be speculation on oil prices. And of course, Goldman Sachs and Wall Street came along and crushed them with their own counter coalition of, oh no, speculation is good for the economy. I do think that the run-up of oil prices from $60 a barrel to 145 and back down to in the 50s again does speak to some kind of speculation, but it will be interesting to see whether the Bob Rubin, Larry Summers wing of the Democratic Party, which appears to be riding high, agrees.
One thing with regard to another thing that you mentioned when he was talking about foreign policy, I mean, this is it's going to be very interesting to see when you saw Tom DeLay on Kosovo, and you saw how kind of sharply he reacted against the Clinton White House, versus a handful of Republicans like John McCain, et cetera, who decided, kind of felt that they were rising above partisanship to kind of back a president in time of war. You're about to see, Afghanistan become a situation where you might see a sharp spike in casualties. And it's interesting. It's very complicated with regard to how this is going to relate to the existing Democratic coalition, because, of course, this was an explicit argument of the Obama campaign that we're going to shift from the wrong front in the war on terrorism to the right front of the war on terrorism. So that will presumably actually help insulate him from some pressures, despite the fact that in Canada, Holland, elsewhere, you've actually seen a lot of pressure over the Afghanistan issue as a kind of pro-war, anti-war kind of axis of conflict. So I think that, it's possible that we actually now have a kind of war on terror nationalism Republican Party that is not going to attack, Obama from kind of the dovish end. But that's not obviously true, given sort of the DNA of the party and given sort of, what might actually be kind of very sort of sharp hostility towards the President Obama, depending on how the next few months goes. Also, I mean, so I think that that's another thing to kind of look to over the next few months in terms of kind of thinking about how these parties have changed, whether or not these changes are enduring, et cetera. There's a lot of other stuff to talk about, but I'll leave it there for now. One last thing is, if you're looking at the white working class, the Republican Party won non-college educated whites by 18%. The Republicans won this constituency by 23% the last time around. Rui Teixeira, who kind of knows the white working class better than anyone, believed that Obama could win if he sort of brought that deficit down to kind of the Republicans winning by only about 12%. So that's amazing, and that really speaks to what Chris said regarding the really radical change in the demographic composition of the population, since 2000. Chris was talking about the death of the Reagan coalition. Bill Kristol and David Brooks were talking about this in 2000, and rightly so, because in terms of kind of the age structure and in terms of, what the moving pieces are, and also with regard to what Jim said regarding the kind of shape of the economy, I think that that's been a dead letter for a long time. And the way to think about the Bush administration from the perspective of reinventing the Republican Party is there was a brief window of opportunity to kind of change these things in time. And there was a kind of rare opportunity to do that, a random kind of new lease on life, and that was totally squandered because of a desire to exclusively talk about taxes.
Let me just seize my prerogatives while this is in the air, because I wanted to drill a little bit on this Reagan coalition by talking about the Latino or Hispanic vote. Because if you look at the maps, 2004, 2008, 2000, 2008, you're exactly right that the swing in white votes, no matter what income group you focus on, though interesting and decisive in some places, is not dramatic. But the swing in Hispanic voting patterns between 2004 and 2008 was the single biggest swing. And it's someplace in the broad world that we would call the Reagan coalition, isn't it? I mean, it's Catholic, it's values informed, it's also economically vulnerable. So my question is, how durable is that change, and what is it made of in your? I wish Gregory and Andres were here as well, but any of you who feel like
I think
about that.
This gets to, I think, the biggest problem Republicans have, which is the demographic problem. I mean, the numbers, young people, the numbers are pretty stunning. 66% of between 18 and 29-year-olds voted for Obama, but among young Hispanics, the number was well over 70%, and that's a real problem for Republicans. The country's getting less white, it's getting more secular. It's getting less married, and all of those groups are voting strongly.
What explains the swing between 2004 and 2008, in your judgment? All economic anxiety?
I think it's a fallout from obviously from the Bush years, and I think it's two things. Personally, I think it's one is that it's a response to the failure of the Bush presidency, especially from an economic standpoint. I think you could look at events like Katrina and the war in Iraq, obviously, sort of puncturing the notion of Republican competence. And I think that, also it's obviously that the appeal that Obama had for a new generation of voters. But I think, part of the thing is for Republicans is that, Tom Schaller had a piece in Salon where he asked about, what does this election mean? And to me, it meant the era of conservatism is over in American politics. And it's the longest death spiral in American politics, maybe since the New Deal coalition. It's been sort of 16 years, Republican conservative movement has been sort of getting less and less power and losing more and more, and winning elections, yet losing sort of its ideological influence. I think what happened as election was that you saw a political party that really was sort of bereft of new policy ideas. I mean, I was a year ago, I wrote a piece for Politico saying how strange it was a year ago that Republicans were running against socialism. You had Romney talking about Hillary Clinton could bring Hillary Clinton to Karl Marx, and you had Giuliani complaining about socialism and healthcare, and I thought it was kind of a funny thing. I didn't, under any circumstances, imagine a year later that the Republican nominee for president would be running on a platform of calling Democrats socialists, but that's kind of what happened in the last month of the campaign. And to me, it suggested that a party that really had no real serious ideas for how to govern the country. They hadn't read Reagan's book, unfortunately, and what they had instead was basically the same sort of fear tactics against Democrats. And I think what happened, in a lot of sense, was that it didn't work because, first of all, people saw the Republicans as being, frankly, 4 more years of the same politics as being worse than 4 more years of Barack Obama.
I'm still poking at this question of how durable the swing in the Latino vote is and why.
I think it depends on how effective Obama is in reaching out to those voters and sort of being the kind of president he ran on. If he can be as sort of accessible and open a president as he was a politician, I imagine he can keep them in the fold for a while.
I think 2 quick things. I think one on durability. My sort of operating framework for the Obama administration is that the lesson of the Bush years to me was that over the short term you can separate good politics and good policy, but over the long term you cannot. The two are essentially they're coterminous, and that's essentially the substance is really going to matter. 4 years from now, if the country's in bad shape, Obama's probably going to lose. And if the country is in better shape, if the economy is growing, if we have redeployed in a somewhat sensible, kind of safe manner, and so the durability of the coalition this is a real kind of proof in the pudding. 4 years. I mean, do things get better for your average voter? So I think the durability is there. The one thing I want to mention about Latinos, I think there was a longer memory among Latinos about the kind of immigration politics we saw in the early part of the election than there was among political reporters and a lot of people. We had this very weird thing happen in which in the Republican primary, immigration was going to be the issue, particularly when people were going to these town halls in Iowa, and I was reporting on it also. And there was a what turned out to be numerically a small number of people with tremendous and intense passion about the issue. And I do not want to claim that people who favor a more highly restrictive immigration policy are ipso facto racist, because I don't believe that, and there are arguments to be made about a more restrictionist immigration policy. That said, I think there was clearly some overlap between people who were proposing that policy prescription and some pretty ugly nationalistic, sort of ethno-nationalistic sentiments. I think that really, the most demagogic and sort of misleading ad that Barack Obama ran the entire campaign explicitly tried to do this, right? He ran this ad, a Spanish language ad in Nevada, in which he basically tried to tie Rush Limbaugh to John McCain, which is, I think we can agree, a fairly unfair thing to do. John McCain really was on the side of the angels in the party's immigration fight. He did, in I think sort of an act of political cowardice, say he wouldn't vote for his own bill. He said, I got the message. But the ad was really quite misleading and unfair. What it did say, though, was, and I believe the tagline was, "We haven't forgotten," I think was the line. Basically saying, look, this guy, this Rush Limbaugh guy, he's in that guy's coalition. So, whatever John McCain is saying, those are the kinds of people who are going to be around the White House and near the White House door if they're elected. And I think that the level of venom that sort of boiled up during that moment had a real lasting imprint on a lot of Latino voters.
I think that's very convincing.
I'd like to talk about Hispanics too, but first I just want to stick up for Ronald Reagan, who I worked for 5 years. as Michael says, Reaganism circa 1980 was to some extent a product of 70% tax rates and 13% inflation and 22% interest rates. Okay, if those things ever come back in any way, shape, or form, Reaganism will come back. I mean, Reaganism is a heavy cure for a problem that admittedly doesn't exist. But as Bill Clinton discovered, you really don't tamper with success. And I'll be very curious to see if Obama lets tax rates get above, 39%. And if the top tax rate under President Obama is 39%, when Reagan took office, it was 70. Then I don't think Republican supply-siders and free marketeers will have a whole lot to complain about. But the left will.
Shooting for 55.
On the Hispanic issue, this is something that there's no disputing. I don't think that the passions ran hot in the Republican primary, and my candidate Mike Huckabee was certainly a part of that debate, and I don't doubt that it hurt McCain among Hispanic voters this year. However, I think that the problem of what to do about the issue is, shall we say, unresolved, and is now turns to a new generation of leadership to figure out what to do on such simple questions as, can you come into this country illegally? Seems to me a reasonable argument. I think this issue has been settled pretty decisively in Europe, in countries that most Democrats look to for leadership on these issues. They have pretty tough immigration policies. Okay, not on these issues, I see. Well, the reason they came to those conclusions on controlling immigration were twofold. One was national security, which I think is sort of a transcendent issue. And the other is running a welfare state. Can you run a welfare state for the world? And if you can't, then how do you turn the spigot down a little bit? And if I think that I just would, again, so I've made this point before, but now it's incredibly more relevant because President Obama will be soon having to wrestle with this. If Eliot Spitzer tried to give driver's licenses in New York State to illegals and got clobbered by his own state government, his own Democratic state government, then and driver's licenses, however symbolic they are free, then what's going to happen when the Obama administration tries to deliver health care to illegals? If you can't get driver's licenses through New York, how are you going to get health care at $5,000 or $10,000 a person through America, through the Congress, through red states? How are you going to get? I'll be extremely interested in what my colleagues and maybe Steve have to say about how they're going to thread that needle. So I think that the issue of my hunch would be eventually that any Democrat mindful of deficits and so on, and the size of the budget will have to come up with some way of controlling illegal immigration, in which case Tom Tancredo will have his victory.
So just one last question before we turn to the floor. Did you want to say something about the Latino vote?
Just very briefly, I mean, I think this is implicit in everyone's remarks, but the Latino vote, the composition of it today is very different from the composition of it 4 to 8 years ago because you have lots of new voters. You mentioned the kind of, young Latino vote, and I think that, if you just think of them purely as identical to whites who are either college educated or non-college educated, just think of them as kind of having assimilated. I mean, imagine a big new group of voters, kind of coming of age during the Bush years, just totally bracket the immigration issue and sort of related issues. I think this was a debate that happened among Democrats. When you look at the supposed black-brown split during the primaries, of course it vanished because, I mean, sort of they were voting on the same economic issues that everyone else is, but this also speaks to what Jim is saying. I'm actually a lot more optimistic about Republican prospects with that constituency and others for precisely that reason. I think that, you could make the argument that Reaganism was incomplete. Toward the tail end, he was looking into catastrophic health insurance and other, kind of like pretty sweeping measures that would have changed the structure of the economy to the extent that it emphasizes kind of middle-class economic advancement, which I think is, kind of really what it was about. Then I think that you could see something that could appeal to lots of voters without actually trying to niche out to like different ethnic groups.
I think it's also, it's worth just one thing I would mention is you can't ignore the fact that, Barack Obama as an African-American running for president, that has an impact, I think, in minority communities. I mean, his numbers among minority communities, not just Hispanics, but across the board, Indian Americans, Arab Americans, he outperformed John Kerry by significant numbers. And I think that, I don't think this is coincidental. I mean, you go back to look at someone like Kennedy in '60, who obviously ran better among Catholics, but he also ran very well among ethnic Protestants in northeastern urban areas. And I think there was a sort of sense of sort of shared identity as sort of an outsider in America. And I think that part for Obama actually plays to his favor with minority voters.
So I want to leave lots of time for questions. We've got a great audience, but I just wanted to ask one last follow-up before we turn to them about taxation. It was sort of the unfinished exchange between Jim and Chris, and so I'm going to direct the question to Chris. What level of taxation can the Obama presidency bear? If it's top marginal rates, that's one subject, but it's total taxation is another. I mean, I'm not sure that the VAT is plausible in American politics. I mean, maybe Rehan will tell us that it is, but it's sort of a stunning thing to consider.
Yeah.
And the question has to also address the obvious inheritance of this campaign, where there was a debate about taxation that bore no relation to the unfolding economic crisis and the unfolding fiscal pressures that were building up by consensus as a result of that crisis. So now you either tax your way into some state of gradual balance, or you inflate your way out of the problem, in which case you're back to the conditions, or half the conditions that created the Reagan Revolution in the first place. So what is the framework, if you're sitting with the president-elect now, looking out over 4 years, how much tolerance is there in the polity for either inflation on the one hand, or aggregate tax increases on the other?
Well, it's a really good question. I mean, if I can answer this succinctly, they should hire me in the White House. I think. Look, I think there is. I don't know what the tolerance level is, but it's above where we are now. And I think particularly distributionally, I think there are things like, for instance, stock transfer tax, sometimes known as a stamp tax, which has been floating around kind of liberal policy circles and progressive policy circles for a while. Actually was one of the 3 sort of papers written defending it. One was by Joseph Stiglitz, one was actually by Larry Summers, written right before he joined the Treasury. As soon as he went in the Treasury, he was like, oh, no. I didn't mean that. I don't know what I was thinking when I wrote that. But I think that there is going to have to be a way to create revenue streams. I mean, at the risk of sounding banal, I mean, this is not something that we've sort of tried to wrestle with. I think in the short term that it's true that we're going to run deficits, and I think there seems to be some consensus on that. What I would like to see is some way of, this is easy to do in the abstract and hard to do in reality. Is taxing the financial sector more effectively and more robustly. And I think that there's some interesting ideas, one of which was sort of floated by Chuck Schumer in the form of some kind of sort of pooled insurance, some sort of financial insurance. Now the question is, once you get the capital from that, then if you go off and you start doing stuff with it, that defeats the whole purpose. But there's going to have to be creative ways. I think we can raise top marginal tax rates. I also think, and only just the last thing, one of the unspoken stories, I think, of the last few years politically is the stress of property taxes. Because it's a local issue, it never comes up in national political conversations. But if you cover local politics, it is the flip side of the housing boom has been insane assessments. Families living in Chicago and neighborhoods that I lived in on the west side of Chicago, which were poor neighborhoods with assessments that they essentially could not afford to pay. That has been, I think, the key sort of site of tax revolt. The decline of the housing bubble is going to ease that quite a bit. So that's another, even though there's no logical connection between that necessarily and what the national tax policy is as a kind of emotional sense of one's own taxation rate, that is also going to create, I think, some more elasticity in terms of what can be taxed federally.
Right. Well, the logical connection is that those states and municipalities are not going to stop delivering the services that they're funding with those property taxes, so somebody's going to have to fill that gap. Did you want to say anything, Rayon, about defend the VAT? Is
Just,
the VAT
I think that,
enactable?
I think that it
does
sounds
everyone
crazy
know what the
now.
VAT is who's under 30 or
It's
not?
a
European
consumption
traveler?
tax, basically. It's just sort of every industrialized country has it, and it's just kind of baked into goods that you kind of, that you consume, and also services. So it's like sort of similar to a retail sales tax, but a lot easier to collect and a lot more efficient. And sort of the kind of ideas that it distorts economic activity a lot less. I mean, I think that you've seen Jason Furman and Larry Summers talking very explicitly about the fact that actually when a VAT is used to finance kind of public services, high quality public services, healthcare, et cetera, then it can be understood as progressive despite the fact that its initial impact is regressive. I think that the intellectual spade work has been done for kind of pretty long time, and I think that you're not going to see it happen kind of assuming there's no kind of real crunch or kind of real perceived need for it. But I think that I can certainly imagine it happening within the space of the next 8 years. But yeah, I mean, I think that with regard, and also think about it this way, I mean, rich retirees, people like that are going to be hit by it. These are not necessarily the people who are the core of the Obama coalition. And with regard to what Chris was saying with regard to property tax, I think this is very, very astute. And I think that it also kind of shapes, if you decompose the kind of relatively affluent voters and sort of look at who is kind of voting which way, I think that actually property taxes, what Howard Dean called the Bush tax hike, is actually kind of very, very salient. If you think of, health insurance premiums is not buying you a kind of better quality of service, and you think of it as a basket of services that's required to kind of lead a middle class life, then it's not obvious that the Bush tax cuts have actually kind of reduced those fixed costs of that kind of broad ecology of kind of middle class public goods. So I think that when you think about sort of the taxes, you need to think a little bit more broadly about sort of all of that stuff.
Can I say, one thing? It's interesting. I hate to I've never done this before, but I'm actually going to cite Dick Cheney here. But I think in 01 or 02, he said deficits don't matter. And I was, it turned out that he was correct in the sense that for George Bush, it didn't really matter very much for his re-election campaign. And it is striking that the notion of fiscal sanity or fiscal responsibility never got really mentioned much in this campaign. I mean, obviously, McCain talked about cutting spending a great deal, but really rarely in the context of kind of deficit. And I just wonder a little bit, 92 when Clinton was elected, he was elected to fix the economy, but of course the deficit was a huge issue and ended up becoming, his primary focus for his budget plan. I don't get the sense that there's any real call out there for more fiscal responsibility and for Barack Obama to try to balance the budget. If anything, he might have some more leeway in the first year or two to actually expand the deficit, which gives him a lot of opportunity, I think, to be a little more aggressive.
I think no one disagrees with that. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's sort of a striking element. I think that maybe the tax issue will not be as big an issue in the short term, simply because I think he can blow up the deficit.
Well, so you're saying he won't raise taxes? Okay.
No.
I mean, or not raise them much.
Just not
Fair
on the
enough.
middle class.
Fair enough.
Reed.
Hi, really interesting comments so far, and I'm very much pleased to hear your thoughts on kind of some of the structural forces and the demographic trends. I mean, I think that some of the ones touched on that were most significant were the Hispanic locking in, and then the youth vote, which obviously went for the Democrat, but went at kind of levels we've never really seen before. But if we could kind of shift a little bit to get your thoughts on the candidate. I mean, how much was it that we were dealing with a special candidate, a special operation? Much was made of the enthusiasm gap. We had these kind of battleground states that almost all went one way. And to what extent, was this, could you kind of address Obama as a phenomenon and as a character in the unfolding campaign?
Well, first I should say that the reason that Obama won Virginia is my younger brother who's sitting here in the front row was the deputy field director.
Well, a lot of younger brothers went to Virginia.
That's right, yeah, that's right. But he actually was the one that tipped the scales.
And I might add, a lot of Marylanders went to Virginia as well. I mean,
yeah, I think, look, I think that the reason that that's a difficult question to answer is because it's, you can say a lot of non-falsifiable things about it. It's just one of these black box situations of covering politics in which there's, I have my impressions. My impressions is that he's a spectacular candidate, and he's inordinately and immensely talented, very rhetorically gifted, sophisticated intellectually, disciplined, calm, poised, all of these adjectives that have been attributed to him. And I think that the standard interpretation of how that redounded to his benefit, which is calm sort of in choppy waters, it seems correct and plausible and true to me. And the way he manages campaign, one of the things that I think just to make a distinction here, the election margin was big enough and the circumstances of the country were big enough that I think that most of the margin was provided by that stuff. You see what I'm saying? If it had been closer to a 50-50 election, I think that there was a certain extent to which the ground game, which was really, if anyone here spent any time around it, just an absolutely remarkable revolutionary kind of thing. that was providing something. But in the overall context of if you're going to stack up all the factors that made Barack Obama president, I think the objective conditions of the country and these sort of structural things kind of stack up the first 2/3 of the way, and the last third of the way is his own remarkable asset and skills as a politician of the campaign.
I'm aware that there's a certain amount of lyricism on the left about Obama and his wonders and so on. I'm keeping a little file just for future reference. I would just say, look, winning with 52% of the vote is impressive. It's not extraordinary. It doesn't look to me transformational. In and of itself, I would say that I think every Republican is thinking hard about this. Is that between Acorn and all the associated vote mobilization tactics, legal and illegal, that come with that, and Silicon Valley. I read a story that said that 91% of Silicon Valley firms supported Obama, and the level of technological innovation. Josh Green in The Atlantic a few months ago had a terrific piece about how Obama mobilized, and I'm sure there'll be a lot more of that kind of discovery in terms of just political tactics. In terms of, the failures of Bush governance, as Michael touched on, are striking. And similarly, the kind of overratedness of Karl Rove as a political genius in terms of micro-targeting and all these things. That was the hot technology of 10 years ago. The hot technology of 10 years of today is getting text messages on your cell phone all the time, or whatever else. Maybe stuff that I don't even know about because I wasn't on a lot of the Obama lists. It is clearly a factor. Newt Gingrich said recently that in terms of political development, the Democrats are like a team that just won the Super Bowl, and the Republicans are like a mid-level college team. And now that maybe somebody might say, well, that's just him making Republicans feel good about losing. That's possible, but it's also possible that it's true.
Jim, what were the illegal vote mobilization techniques?
John Fund wrote a whole book, which I suspect he'll never be invited to the New America Foundation to speak about. But it's called Vote Fraud, and it's 200 or 300 pages, and anybody here is
Don't read it.
90%. One of the things that came out in the exit polls is that 90% of the Obama voters were either software engineers or felons.
Yeah, I think it's to your point. In 2004, the Bush campaign, won that campaign at some level because they had a much better ground game, because they spent their money well, they reached out to their voters, they got them out to the polls. Obama, did that, exponentially better in this campaign. I think there's two things. Chris earlier mentioned about that the Democrats sort of supported, obviously, financially at Wall Street, but what Obama did on fundraising and how he raised money in his campaign is revolutionary. He spent, I don't know, $150 million he raised in September. I don't even know what the numbers were for October. Crazy amount, and it was all from small donations he raised his money from individual Americans. He showed how you can use technology to mobilize voters. And I think, to your question a little bit, it does show that being a community organizer can actually be a useful resume or background for running for president. His campaign was based in large extent on his background as an organizer, and I think that's not something you can ignore here.
Yes.
A question for everybody. First is spinning off of what everybody was talking about Obama's talents. If he seizes the moment now to invest in infrastructure and deliver health care without raising taxes and everyone's quality of life increases, will he be able to marshal his skills to explain to the country why 4 years down the line, when everything's better, now's sort of the time to raise taxes, and would an American audience be receptive to that? And then to Jim, just to guess, if Acorn had filed 0 fraudulent ballots, what would the margins in the election be?
I'll let Jim answer that first, but I want to follow up.
We'll reconvene on voting for on another occasion. I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole.
We'll put voting.
We're 45 seconds to answer that.
I'll put vote fraud aside and just say that I grew up in Chicago. Enough said. On the issue of just Obama's prospects, if he, as a Republican who didn't vote for Obama, if he delivers health care, builds infrastructure, doesn't raise taxes, and the economy does well, and I'll throw in, gets out of Iraq, then he's going to win pretty comfortably. just period. Just one fun fact. Since 1896, a party has won the White House, a party now, and lost it after only 4 years, only once. And that was Carter in 76 to 80. Now, there's every other time that a single-term president, Harding or Kennedy or somebody came along, he was followed by another president of the same party. So for Obama to lose in 2012, it'll take a Carter-like performance, which your question presupposes can't happen.
But I think that sort of my sense of the question is that, let's say he does win re-election, let's say he has been broadly successful, will he be able to change the kind of environment concerning taxes? Because clearly this time around, he clearly hedged his bets. I mean, sort of have we transitioned to another era in terms of normative understanding of sort of the tax? And I think the answer is yes. I think that sort of if he accomplishes these things, but I put a slightly different spin on it. I think that, when you're looking at the country, the things that I sort of pay attention to, you have a world wherein it takes 3.5 years of average annual income to buy a house. It's going, in Western Europe it's 7. We're going to be moving closer to that direction. All of the reforms that you've talked about are things that are actually going to require new revenue, and they also are things that you're going to see in these places that have those land use restrictions, in these places that are denser and that are going to be more diverse. In an environment that's more diverse, I mean, it's funny because you both have this thing where there are some welfare states that these states are defined by a lot of homogeneity and kind of shared normative understanding. Racism is something that's kept states small in some regions, and that kind of distress. But at the same time, the kind of social trust, and the kind of rhetoric of self-reliance, and those things kind of coexist. You have self-reliance in areas where you have high levels of social cooperation. Utah and the Mormons, blah, blah, blah. And obviously in Fairfax County, where you have, kind of lots of folks from Sudan who are your neighbors now, and you're kind of like an aging sort of white couple, and you're terrified. And then you kind of imagine that every kind of Latino kid is part of an immigrant gang, and part of the immigrant gang plague, et cetera. This is going to change your worldview in lots of complicated ways. It doesn't necessarily push you to the right. It could actually make you want government as a broker. So I think that, so the things that you're describing, and it's actually very interesting because in terms of whether or not there's going to be a return of the kind of Reaganist gestalt, is this idea of what are going to be the burdens for a middle class family in terms of achieving kind of this really deep seated sort of normative ideal of the kind of suburban American dream. If you have this green industrial policy that's financed by sort of kind of taxing the rich, say, and then sort of transforming those resources to clean coal to help distressed communities in West Virginia and Montana and other areas. I mean, this is going to be a very, very big transfer of resources. That's going to be slow moving, but sort of it's going to be real. And it's also something that reflects a lot of priorities of the center left. I think that there's going to be a backlash to that. And I think that, kind of when you're looking at something like, if you look at sort of, creating a carbon price, there has already been sort of inching away from talking about a carbon price explicitly to talking about technology, sort of, et cetera. But if you have a carbon price, in order to do that, you're going to have to actually buy off a lot of political actors, within this bigger coalition. Everyone wants a bigger coalition, but one complicating factor is that you kind of want to have a minimum winning coalition, so that actually dividing the spoils is somewhat easier. So I think that that's going to be a real complication, given that you have Democrats from energy producing regions, Democrats from energy consuming regions right now. So I think that it's actually more plausible to me that actually you're going to see a lot of the environmental agenda jettisoned, at least in the medium term. You're going to see a lot more kind of talk of infrastructure, et cetera. I think that that's a shame, probably, but I think that the way that stuff is going to be framed. So everything you're describing as marking success, I think actually will lead to a kind of tax ratchet. You look at what happened to New Labor. I mean, they made an explicit bargain that said that you want higher quality public services, we're also going to you're going to be paying slightly higher taxes, or some of you will be paying slightly higher taxes. And they made, just as Bush 1 and Reagan and Bush 2, they made their sort of income tax more progressive, but then they had to actually find stealthier ways of raising revenue, et cetera. But I think that the question is, how is that going to change the country, and how will sort of a lot of these kind of aspirational voters react to the ways that it's changed the country? Will they perceive this as actually kind of limiting their ability to achieve some of their kind of core economic ambitions? And that's going to be the opportunity for Republicans.
Yes.
Let me just take two questions, so we'll turn the corner here, first here and then behind. Okay.
Both candidates ran on bipartisanship, and you are talking about whether the country will see this as a mandate. You four gentlemen seem to get along fine. The two candidates met yesterday. Will the Hill see this as a mandate? Will congressional Republicans, Blue Dogs, and the most liberal Congress people, will they be able to get along with the administration?
Yeah. Go ahead. Why don't we take both of these questions?
Okay. Yeah, my question is basically this. How much did the international appeal of Obama play a role in his election? In the sense that obviously the economy is a central factor, and when you're running in any election, People's pocketbooks are of most concern. I think that was the central thing. But if you look at this, if this election was run a year ago, I think this election would have been also a key pillar of the Republican Party would have been security. And that was obviously eclipsed by the economy. And I think you see, obviously, when you saw Obama go abroad, the massive appeal, and also even for the first time in many instances, you had actually heads of state endorsing Obama. And you have now major increased international cooperation is needed in Afghanistan and Iraq, but also international investment is needed. Some people say he came across as anti-trade, but I think if people really looked at it, he came across as fairer trade. And and the people are also seeing that this economic fallout is global.
Right.
And you have
Right.
a lot of high-income people who are saying, if I can increase our international investments,
Right.
then we're better off.
So how much did we want to be liked, Michael?
I tend to think that is unfortunately not much of a fact. I think people who are going to vote for Obama probably made a difference, but I can't imagine it swayed that much the electorate, if only because the economy was the number one issue. And I just think in the end it probably didn't
But
make
if it hadn't been in the midst of such an overwhelming economic storm, do you think that in fact swing voters processed this question on a sort of 50-50 basis, that half of them thought that if he's popular abroad, that's a reason to be suspicious and to identify with McCain's concerns, and that the other half thought it would be great to have a representative of this country that other people were instantly responsive to? Or do you think that nobody knows the answer to that?
I think nobody knows. I think nobody knows. But my sense of it would be that Republicans were suspicious of it, who were partisans, and Democrats who were partisans thought it was a good thing. And for swing voters, it probably didn't matter all that much. But if I can just get to the first question about being bipartisan, I think this gets back to, for Republicans to have a tough choice to make. I mean, to me, in some ways, this is comparable, and the situation we're in now, a little bit to post 9/11. And I'll say this because people want to see Obama succeed. And I think this is true for Democrats or Republicans. I mean, the country's in a bad place right now. People want to see him succeed. So for Republicans to be obstructionists like as they were in '93, and very effectively, I may add, and got them control of Congress, I think there's much bigger cost to doing it this time than it was in '93. And if I'm Republicans, I think to be overly partisan and to not try to work with Obama is going to be, I think, is a foolish thing to do. Of course, the problem is if they work too close with him, they can identify themselves as contrasting themselves to Obama. They're in a tough spot. I think their probably short-term play is to be bipartisan, and then if they can find areas to separate themselves, but it's going to be very, very difficult.
Yeah. Just a quick point about bipartisanship. Bipartisanship is a form. It's not a content. It's a means and not an end. I mean, so if you are a Republican who doesn't believe in that the world is warming because of carbon emissions, there's no reason to be bipartisan on a cap and trade regime. I mean, again, like, I don't want to overstress the substance of matter, but I think the incentives towards bipartisanship are gonna shift depending on the issue. I also think that in the House, basically, Republicans that are left in the House now, I mean, one hates to use the phrase rump caucus, but the Republicans that are left in the House now, I mean, they have survived two pretty strong purges, and if you're still standing in the House, you're probably from a pretty safe district. You are likely not from a district that where you think that you're going to get kicked out because you didn't support the socialist agenda of Barack Hussein Obama. So I think that it could cut the other way. I think it's possible, particularly in the House, and this is much less the case in the Senate. But in the House, you can see I don't think there's going to be tons of incentive on the part of the Republican minority to play nice.
Can I ask Mark Schmidt to talk about the Senate a little bit? Because during the campaign at these events, you forecasted the final death throes of the Rockefeller Republicans, and I think there's 3 of them left, depending on how you count them. But if the Rump Caucus in the Senate certainly has some of those characteristics, but it also includes Susan Collins, at least, and Olympia Snowe, so that's 2, who are presumably imprisoned by they really do have to vote for the socialism of Barack Hussein Obama if they expect to, if they want to run for re-election anyway. But so anyway, what is your portrait of the majorities, the working majorities in this sense that are available to the President-elect
Well, I think it's comparable to, and I have some of this in the story that I have in the current American Prospect. I mean, it's sort of comparable to the early Reagan coalitions where he sort of assembled shifting groups that had either very conservative Democrats in them, or in certain cases actually found common ground with more liberal Democrats, like on the tax reform of 1986. So that there's plenty of room, and bipartisanship, I guess I would make 2 points about bipartisanship. One, it only really matters in the Senate. And two, it is the norm. I mean, the extreme partisanship of that kind of begins when Dole kind of locks everyone down in, we're not letting Bill Clinton have anything, is a very, very unusual move in American politics. And the effort to do super one-party rule, what Dennis Hastert, when he was Speaker of the House, called majority of the majority. It wasn't supported by a majority of Republicans, it wasn't happening. Excludes a lot of bipartisanship. Those two are extremely unusual and as they should recognize now, unsustainable modes of operation. So, Mitch McConnell, he will have it. There are people in the Republican Senate caucus who don't believe that global warming is man-made and so forth, and Senator Inhofe will be Senator Inhofe. But there are enough, Collins and Specter and Lugar and so forth. I mean, Lugar all but endorsed Obama, allowed his image to be used in advertising. You don't do that lightly. There's not much play for some of these, frankly, older senators to sort of put up the same kind of lockstep opposition that they did in 1993-94. They're not going to be in the majority again. Their legacy is not going to, does our inspector want his legacy to be, I blocked health care twice? Why would you want that to be, you want that on your tombstone? And so I just think there's enormous, but Obama, to his credit, I think is extremely smart about those things. And the fact that he sort of developed a relationship with Lugar from day one. Clinton didn't understand that actually what I need to be doing is meeting with Arlen Specter and Dick Lugar and people like that. And I think I have every confidence that Obama does. And that's how you form a sustainable coalition.
Steve?
Yes.
Just a few comments. Just for inspiration in the wilderness years, I've just read a biography of William Borah, the senator from Idaho, the biographer said that he supported, of the 17 major New Deal programs, he supported 11 of them. And in 1936, when Roosevelt was carrying Idaho 2-1, Borah was reelected by 2-1. So there's plenty of, I think, that's for Rockefeller Republicans. Look, the leading Rockefeller Republican is Arnold Schwarzenegger. He doesn't really go by that title, but he proves, including getting reelected in 2006, otherwise a bad year, that there's a appeal if you can find it. I do believe that Republicans are about to make a major rediscovery of the Constitution. I'm walking around with this book, which is James Burnham's.
8 years too late.
8 years too fine. Well, again, it's just when Democrats are discovering the joy of Zeitgeist and Volonté Generale, Republicans are going to go back to nitpicking and particularism and proceduralism, and a new Bob Walker, to pick a name from the past, or Bob Bauman, pick a name from even further back in terms of people who were just there to gum up the works. I think those people will reassert themselves in a substantial way. And I'll just make a couple points. One, and I think Rehan alluded to it earlier, I would not want to be a Democrat voting for a $1 trillion tax increase called cap and trade. I really wouldn't. And I don't mean, I include, think about any Democrat from West Virginia or New Mexico or North Dakota, just to name a few places. I would not want to be in charge of administering this bailout. I will admit that I work at Fox News, and therefore it was of particular interest to me to see that GE Capital, which is the part of General Electric, which is then also therefore a sibling to NBC, MSNBC, and CNBC, got a $139 billion loan guarantee. And again, you can't blame that on President Obama, but you can say that this bailout, as it proceeds, whether it's the automobile industry or anything else, is going to be a mess. And I think that the Republicans will find that the basis of their opposition is people like Joe the Plumber. I realize he's a little,
Who is he?
It may not be a plumber. His name might not be Joe. But the idea of
Starting with
the idea of the individual getting crushed by the EPA or OSHA or cap and trade or card check. This will be incredibly powerful, and I'll make a prediction that the Republicans gain seats. So the period where Obama has the most opportunity to get things done will be right away, because I think by 2010 there'll be more Republicans in Congress.
Yes, please.
Yeah, I wanted to add something. I think that there is something incredibly potent politically about people's visceral reaction to the bailout, and what it signifies is essentially, the worst of big government married to the worst of big business, and it's a unifying in that sense. One of the big problems we have right now is we are entering an era of profound uncertainty and kind of ideological unmooring. And the way that I interpret it is that we're sort of entering an era in which there's a lot of kind of social democratic solutions called for without the machinery of state necessary to actually implement social democracy in an efficient, fair, in kind of good government way. So we have this kind of gutted husk of a crony capitalist state, and then we have all these kind of social democratic, from my perspective, good social democratic goals. The marriage of those two makes me deeply uneasy. In fact, I find myself sort of feeling very kind of Austrian about it all, and very worried about really worried about all the rent seeking, and because I don't, I cover Washington for a living, and I don't really trust. And I don't mean this as a philosophical point, which is the point the Austrians make and that Hayek makes and a lot of conservatives make, which is that de facto, by definition, I actually just think the actual government we have, you go to crisis with the government you have, and the government we have is not a particularly well-suited or equipped government after these last 8 years to do things like manage $350 billion of industrial policy. So
I could totally identify with that anxiety, and I became aware of it when I started to romanticize the Resolution Trust Corporation. Let's outsource the implementation of social
Get that checked out,
democracy. Protect it from the federal government.
That relates to Brian's point, though, and I think that if you're looking at and if you're looking at a broad change in the architecture of how government raises revenue, I mean, that's the kind of longer-term solution for that kind of thing. I mean, from that perspective.
Can I just close, because we've got 5 or 10 minutes left, and I just wanted to finish this conversation that I think is a terrific place to end on about, to some extent, we just went through the pull side of the potential working majorities through which these problems will be explored by talking about Congress. But we haven't really addressed Reed's question about the presidency. How will this president build coalitions, and will he use some of the techniques that he built up in the campaign, instant communication, electronic communities, in a way that will be meaningful or not? And I actually wanted to interview Chris's brother about this as a way to start the conversation, because I also had a family member who worked as a field organizer in Iowa, and through her, what was so striking was the personal role that Obama played on the conference calls every week, firing these people up. He had such an intuition about who they were, what they were doing, and what would motivate them. And he was very attentive to the flow of the week and the month. And so it wasn't, I think from the outside, it looked like a big machine, but it was really authored, I thought, through him. And I wondered, from your experience in Virginia, what, in the throes of a much bigger, less concentrated period than Iowa, which was obviously the whole game at that time, what did you see of his leadership, and what would you extrapolate into the governing phase in terms of his own interest in building kind of grassrootsy context for policy?
I think a lot's been played about the calmness that permeated the campaign, and I think that certainly played out on the battle of the day-to-day if you won the news cycle, and they were very much into don't worry about what happened immediately, keep your eye on the prize. And I hope he takes that to the White House, and that the first 100 days, obviously, I mean, he's gearing up for that push, but at the same time, still trying to think of like what he does in his first act as president. How does that play out in the midterms? How does that play out in re-election and so forth? I thought it was very telling that he had organizers in states that weren't in play for redistricting for 2010. That played very much in mind of like, they weren't just thinking about the short-term gains. It's very much like a long-term solution. I think that was the biggest break from Clintonism, in that it wasn't these, how do I get myself elected? It was like, how do I infrastructurally build, state legislators, build up a farm team in these red states to run them in 2010, to run them in 2012. And I think, the most impressive thing about the Obama operation was really just kind of this cohesiveness, but also just keeping everyone on the eye on the prize. And that, like, the day-to-day monotony of, making calls and knocking on doors really built up to, this cresting of a wave. And I think, I'm hoping he takes that to the White House, and that, the steps that he does take, in a certain way build momentum for larger, more ambitious, social democratic goals. And so I'm hoping, that's kind of where it goes. My personal hope was that, the email list that he's accrued and the grassroots that he's cultivated can be used to really lean on blue dogs and conservative Democrats to be like, don't fuck with me. Like, I won your district. I have, 1,000 donors and 2,000 volunteers there. If you really want to go to toe-to-toe, like, we'll find someone to run against you and we'll win. I think that's a little hardball and don't actually see Obama doing that. But I think, there's a certain amount of, leverage that he can.
Your adrenaline is still running. All right, can we have each of you comment on this or anything else?
Just one quick comment. I'm hearing the word social democracy a lot this morning.
Any closing comments beyond that, Jim?
I just want to say, I think the one thing about, someone was asking this question about how will Obama, what's like a sort of Sister Soldier moment, how is he going to sort of step on sort of liberal interest group? And, it's funny because he really, I'm not sure how he's going to overreach. It's kind of interesting. If he does what he just said he would do when he ran for president, it's in many ways it's hard to see how that's going to have a Clinton-like situation, like Gays in the military-like situation you saw in '93. And so I think, from his perspective, he needs to continue on the same themes that he ran on, which basically was, follow through on middle-class tax cut, follow through on a health care plan, infrastructure. I mean, all these things that he wants to do, he seems to have pretty broad support for. And I think the key, again, as Mark suggested, is to be as bipartisan as possible. I mean, the world has changed in the last 2 or 3 months, and he has a much bigger window to accomplish some things he wants to accomplish. And he has this huge army of people out there who passionately support him. I mean, seeing those pictures from election night myself, of people, so emotionally overwrought over this idea of Obama victory. I mean, he has a real opportunity to do something unique and different, not since, I think, FDR in '32.
I would just add one point on overreach, and that is, it's as Aristotle said, there's a phenomenon in technoi, which is things you don't control that still happen. When I, we alluded past to issues of the Republicans and the way Tom DeLay and Denny Hastert ran the Congress, and obviously they didn't do a very good job of disciplining the party and keeping outside groups from primarying people and so on. And in terms of candidate recruitment, they did a terrible job. So when all those losses are now factored into the results of 2006 and 2008. But in terms of overreach and doing things wrong, when I see Terry McAuliffe, the ultimate Beltway, political rent-seeking, anti-Austrian millionaire, now wants to buy himself the governorship of Virginia without having run for anything else before. I think this would be a test of this vaunted Democratic machine. If they can keep somebody like him from getting the Democratic nomination, they may well win the governorship in Virginia next year. And if they let him get the nomination, at a rock bottom minimum, they will remind every Republican that the worst of Clintonism is still regnant in the Democratic Party. And I think they could very well lose the seat.
It's the most unfair test imaginable.
Governor Haley Barbour, the first to point out McAuliffe's vulnerabilities.
I think this question of what the post, I think Luke's point, and not just unrelated to him, about the strategic nature of the way that Obama has approached everything is really it is really the defining trait. It was the defining trait of the campaign, and I think it'll be the defining trait of the presidency. Now the question is, can you, you may not be interested in the news cycle, but the news cycle is interested in you. So, how much that sort of strategic perspective can be maintained amidst the craziness of governing the world's lone superpower remains to be seen. I do think, though, that at the end of the day, it really is going to come down to, can he deliver the things that he campaigned on? And in some ways, it is the politics of it are complicated, and the details are complicated. But the main core of what he has to do in the next 4 years is not mysterious. And I think that's to his benefit ultimately, that the agenda is fairly clear.
Just one thing briefly. I mean, I think people forget that financial deregulation and sort of not of the kind of commodity futures era, sort of we're talking about sort of what happened throughout the 80s. There was a huge generational shift. There was a kind of rebellion that happened within the corporate world, and a lot of what you saw happen. I mean, there were powerful entrenched insiders who were opposed to this stuff. It wasn't just the press that hated corporate raiders. It was actually a lot of kind of cushy corporate boards that hated corporate raiders too. They changed the structure of the economy, and I think that. What you're seeing, I sort of, what Chris was talking before about Iraq and about how sort of redeploying in a kind of responsible same way, I think the goalposts are kind of shifting in interesting ways, and I think there are a lot of people who are going to be pulling for President Obama, and I think that, just given his sophistication and given his kind of long-term thinking about building this kind of durable progressive majority, I think there's going to be a big effort to bring corporations on side. I think that's going to be kind of a very important part of the message, and I think that maybe there's going to be this opportunity. It's not obvious that this is true, but maybe there's going to be this opportunity for Republicans to kind of have one of these brief, destructive moments when they can actually shake loose of some of the institutions that they become kind of closely aligned to, just because, kind of as they're shifting their money, kind of to the other side in order to kind of more efficiently sort of seek rents. So I think that, if that does happen, then you have to pay attention to the broken intellectual transmission belt. We were talking about sort of the opposition to the bailout, and like Luigi Zingalis, there are a bunch of these guys who had actually great alternatives to the bailout plan that were a lot cheaper, that were much, much smarter than what the Republican Study Committee offered, but that intellectual transmission belt was broken. Those ideas were not getting to congressional Republicans, and so how do you actually fix that? And can you actually have a Republican Party that, again, is going to kind of come a little loose, just loose enough, so that it can actually offer kind of effective opposition to a Democratic Party that represents big labor and big business? You know what I mean? Maybe, maybe not, but I mean, that's kind of where any kind of Republican hope lies.
Thank you all very, very much for coming, and we'll wrap it up there, and please join me in thanking our panel. And